Nobody walks into the offices of the Beckett syndicate and says no to the man who holds the city's debt ledger. Nobody. Not lawyers, not aldermen, not even the ones with guns tucked under expensive coats. But Faye Ormond, who had $38 in her checking account and 8 months of her dead father's debts stacked on her desk, slid the envelope back across the table and said exactly that. The snow had been falling since Tuesday. By Thursday morning, it had buried the parking lot of Ormond bookkeeping services under 18 centimeters of wet grey slush. Faye hadn't salted the front walk. She hadn't had the energy. She'd spent the last 3 nights cross-referencing her father's personal accounts against the folder the bank had sent. A thin, meticulous document outlining exactly how much of the building's second mortgage he'd quietly drained before his heart finally gave out in March. The answer was $280,000, which would have been manageable in theory, except the bank wasn't the only creditor. The black SUVs pulled into the lot at 10:30, 2 of them moving with the kind of deliberate slowness that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. Faye set down her coffee mug and watched from behind the frosted front window. 3 doors opened, 4 men total. 3 of them moved like they were paid to stand between their employer and anything sharp. The 4th walked as though the entire strip mall had been built for his convenience. She recognized Reed Beckett from the business pages. He'd been photographed outside the Ritz-Carlton at a charity gala 2 years ago, and she had spent one long, humiliating evening before her father's funeral trying to figure out exactly who her father had borrowed from. The photograph had answered that question. She didn't run to lock the door. There was no point. The bell above the entrance chimed as Beckett stepped inside. He was wearing a dark charcoal coat, the kind that absorbed cold light rather than reflected it. His shoes were polished and completely unsuited to the slush outside. The tall man behind him, broad-shouldered, close-cropped, scanned the room the way people scan rooms when they expect to find someone hiding. There was nowhere to hide. The office was one large room, 2 desks, a filing cabinet, a window that hadn't been properly sealed since 2019, and the wall behind Faye's desk covered edge to edge in color-coded sticky notes mapping her father's financial wreckage. "Miss Ormond," Beckett said. No preamble. He had a slight maritime lilt buried under years of Toronto polish, the kind of accent that surfaced only in certain vowels. "Mr. Beckett." She crossed her arms. She didn't offer her hand. He looked at the wall of notes the way a structural engineer looks at a compromised beam, with recognition rather than surprise. Then he reached into his coat and set a cream folder on her desk. "Your father's outstanding balance, with interest accrued since January, sits at $340,000, he said, with the same neutrality she might use to say the GST deadline is Friday. "I'm not here for the furniture." "Then what are you here for?" "My organization operates 4 legitimate businesses. The accountant who handled them moved to Calgary 18 months ago and left incomplete records going back to 2019. I've looked at your work. You cleaned up the Hargrove contracting audit in 2022. He nodded toward the folder. "The arrangement is outlined there. You come on as a financial consultant. Standard invoicing, nothing that draws attention. In exchange, the debt is dissolved, and there's a retainer you'll find reasonable." Faye looked at the folder. She didn't touch it. Then she picked it up, opened it to the first page, read it, and closed it. "No," she said. She slid it back across the desk. The room went quiet in a particular way. The way rooms go quiet when someone has done something everyone else believed was physically impossible. The tall man by the door actually turned his head. Beckett's expression didn't change. "You haven't read the full terms." "I don't need to." She kept her hand flat on the folder, pushing it back to his side of the desk. "You want me to run your legitimate books so that when the RCMP or Revenue Canada starts looking for the seams, they find my name on the filings and your operation reads as a going concern with a paper-clean accountant. I'd be your credibility, your alibi dressed up as a contractor." She met his eyes steadily. "I'm not interested in being someone's legal camouflage." The quiet after that was different, heavier. You understand the alternative, Beckett said. Completely. Her voice didn't waver. She made sure of it. You can take the equipment. The client list is mine personally, not attached to the business entity, so it's not a seizable asset. The furniture is worth maybe $4,000 on a generous day. The lease has a termination penalty clause. You'd net perhaps $11,000 against a $340,000 debt, which is a very poor return on a Thursday morning. She looked at him. If you've decided I'm worth more as an example than as an asset, that's your calculation to make. But I'll tell you what the numbers say. For a long moment, Beckett looked at the wall of sticky notes behind her, the red ones, the yellow column tracking payments her father had promised and quietly redirected. He picked up the folder from her desk. He stood there a moment, turning it in his hands, and she had the strange sense that no one had spoken to him that plainly in a very long time, and that he was doing something he rarely did, recalibrating. Then he left. His men followed without a word. The bell above the door chimed. The SUVs reversed out of the lot with the same quiet deliberateness with which they'd arrived. Faye sat down in her chair. Her hands were trembling. She pressed them flat against the desk and breathed through her nose until they stopped. She gave herself exactly 4 minutes. Then she opened the next client file and went back to work. He came back the following Monday. No SUVs. He drove a dark blue Volvo that was conspicuously unremarkable and parked in the spot nearest the door and he tore before entering, which she hadn't expected. I'm not here with another proposal, he said, standing in the doorway. I want to understand what you saw in the folder, in the first page. Faye studied him. He looked tired, not the surface variety, the kind that lived in the jaw and behind the eyes and didn't resolve with sleep. Sit down, she said, and pointed at the client chair. He sat, and she walked him through it on the whiteboard. The shell company architecture, the invoicing gaps that would trigger a pattern match from even a mid-tier CRA analyst, the way the retainer number sat in a specific band designed to avoid secondary scrutiny thresholds. He asked 3 questions. None of them were stupid questions. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Could you design something cleaner? The 4 legitimate businesses only, actually independent of the rest. Functionally independent or actually independent? Actually. She looked at him. Why would you want to separate them? He didn't answer immediately. His gaze settled somewhere on the middle distance, on the gap between what the question asked and what he was actually prepared to say. Because I'm tired, he said finally, of everything I've built being structurally dependent on everything I'd rather not have built. The afternoon light was thin and grey through the drafty window. I'll look at the existing filings, she said. I'm not promising anything past that. He came in 3 days a week after that, always during business hours, always without the men who moved like they were anticipating something. He would sit at the second desk with paper files, actual paper, which she found inexplicably endearing, and work through them methodically. Occasionally he asked her to explain something. She explained it, or told him the question was wrong and why, and he listened without arguing. It was, in a way she couldn't quite name, one of the stranger things she had experienced in an already strange year. She noticed, during those weeks, small things. That he took his coffee black and never finished it entirely, that he had a habit of pressing his thumb against the scar on his left wrist when he was working through something difficult, the way other people tap a pen, that he was constitutionally incapable of leaving a column unbalanced. She'd watched him spend 20 minutes tracking down a $12 discrepancy in a supplier invoice with the focused intensity of someone diffusing something. She didn't say any of this out loud. Around the 3rd week, she stopped monitoring the exits when he came in. It was the 4th week when she found the notation in the 2021 operating records that didn't match anything in the corporate registry. She pulled 3 adjacent files, cross-referenced against the T2 return, and sat for a long time looking at the shape of what it meant. She looked across the room at Beckett, who was reading something and frowning slightly. This company, she said, and read the numbered name aloud. It's receiving service revenue from the restaurant and the print shop, but the registration lapsed in 2020 and was never renewed. He looked up. Whoever set this up knew what they were doing, she continued, but they stopped maintaining it, and now there's a dormant numbered company collecting declared income from 2 operational businesses with no current legal standing to do so. She turned the page toward him. If someone at the CRA decides to trace this chain, and they do, occasionally, this is the thread that unravels everything else. Beckett crossed to her desk and looked at the file. He stood close enough that she could smell his coat, cold air and something faintly antiseptic, which she filed away without examining. Can it be corrected retroactively? The filing, yes. Amended returns for 2 years, an explanation letter. It's not catastrophic, but it needs to be done. She looked up at him. This is what I mean by actually independent. If these businesses are going to stand on their own, every piece of the structure needs to be real. Not cosmetically real, actually real. He was looking at the file, but she had the sense he was hearing something beyond what she'd said. How did your father manage the books here? He asked, after a moment. She sat back. He didn't. He signed things and let someone else handle it. He thought numbers were beneath him. She glanced at the sticky note wall. He was wrong about a great many things. He wasn't the only one. Beckett pulled the second chair close and sat down beside her desk, which he hadn't done before. He kept looking at the file. My father borrowed from men like me when I was 9. He borrowed because he thought he could turn it around. When he couldn't, they came to our apartment in Dartmouth, and they made their point very clearly, and I was old enough to watch it happen. He turned a page without reading it. I went to work for those men when I was 15, because the alternative was the floor, and I decided I'd rather stand on the wrong side of the room than go back down there. Faye didn't say anything. I know what the ledger costs, Beckett said quietly. I have known since I was 9 years old. I built this because I refused to be owed to anyone ever again, but somewhere in that process, he set the file down. I became the very thing I started from. He looked at her. Your father's name is in my books. I don't say that to threaten you. I say it because I'm not unaware of what that means. Outside, a delivery truck reversed slowly past the window, its backup signal muffled by the snow. My father cried a lot, Faye said. Her voice was level. At the kitchen table, after the racing results. He'd pour a glass of rye and cry, and then call the bookie and make the same bet the next morning. She folded her hands on the desk. I used to think that was weakness. Now I think it was something worse. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he kept doing it anyway, because stopping would have required him to admit he'd already lost. She looked at Beckett. That's the part I can't forgive. Not the losing. The choosing to keep losing when the math was already clear. The quiet between them felt different from the early silences. Less like a standoff, more like 2 people sitting with the same complicated weather. It was a Wednesday evening, past 6, when the front door came open without the bell chiming. Someone had pushed it fast enough to defeat the mechanism. 2 men, young, with the restless energy of people who hadn't yet learned that stillness is its own kind of authority. One had a tear in his jacket at the shoulder. He looked at Faye the way people look at furniture they expect to move out of the way. Looking for Beckett, he said. Words around he's been running errands out east. Faye's hands went still on her keyboard. Beckett wasn't in the office. He'd stepped outside 20 minutes earlier to take a call, but his coat was on the back of the second chair, and the files were open on the desk between them. Wrong address, she said, and stood up, not backing away from the desk, standing in front of it. This is a bookkeeping office. If you're looking for someone, the building directory is in the lobby next door. The second man moved to the filing cabinet and opened the top drawer. That his coat? It belongs to a client who left it last week. She came around the desk. She wasn't sure what she intended to do. She only knew that sitting felt wrong. I'm going to ask you to leave. I have the non-emergency police line on this phone. She held it up. And in this part of Scarborough, the response time is about 4 minutes. I've called before. I'm not squeamish about paperwork. The man at the cabinet looked at her, weighing something. The door opened. Beckett walked in. He read the room in 1 second, the open drawer, the 2 men, Faye standing between them and her desk, and the quality of his stillness changed. Not violent, architectural, the way a building shifts its weight to its foundation. "We're going to step outside," he said, his voice flat and almost bored. He held the door. "Let's not make this the lady's problem." There was a long pause, then they went. Faye heard low voices from the parking lot. 7 minutes, maybe 8. When Beckett came back in, there was a shallow cut across the back of his right hand, and a stillness about him she recognized as the aftermath of adrenaline carefully contained. She pointed at the client chair. He sat, and she got the first aid kit from under the bathroom sink. "Kirby," he said while she cleaned the cut. He wanted to confirm whether the head of the syndicate was genuinely spending his afternoons in a Scarborough strip mall, or whether it was a rumor someone invented to be interesting. Now he has his answer, which creates a problem I made by being careless. You weren't careless. You were working. In my world, those two things aren't mutually exclusive. He looked at the window. The snow was thickening again outside. I'll have to deal with Kirby. She pressed the gauze down and held it. What does that mean? He was quiet for a moment. I've been making calls since this afternoon. His primary supply relationship in Montreal goes through a distributor my family has worked with for 20 years. I asked a favor. His shipment schedules are going to become unreliable over the next few weeks. He'll spend his energy fixing that problem instead of expanding east. He paused. No one gets hurt. It costs me a favor I've been saving, but it's cleaner. Faye looked at his hand, then up at his face. You chose the more expensive option. I chose the option that doesn't end with someone bleeding on your floor. That's not the only reason. He met her eyes. He didn't confirm or deny it, but he didn't look away either. She finished the bandaging, pressed the tape smooth, and sat back. The 2021 amended returns, she said. I can have them drafted by Friday. I'll need you to come in and sign before I submit. Beckett looked at her for a long, unreadable moment. That's what you want to discuss right now. That's the work, she said, and the work doesn't stop because things got complicated. Something shifted in his expression. Not softening, exactly. More like recognition, the way someone looks when they find a thing they had stopped expecting to find. 3 days later, he set an envelope on her desk without comment. She opened it, a bank transfer receipt. The amount matched the figure she had been doing mental calculations around for 8 months, $340,000. Transferred to the lender, balance cleared, account closed. The debt is gone, he said. No conditions. It should have been separate from everything else from the beginning. I made it conditional because I thought conditions were the only language the situation understood. He looked at the receipt she was holding. I was wrong about that. Faye looked at the numbers for a long time. The paper was very still in her hands. She thought about the kitchen table, the racing forms, the glass of rye her father kept refilling to avoid looking up at her. She thought about herself at 17, learning to read a balance sheet because someone in the family had to, and deciding very clearly that the numbers would not lie to her the way people did. She thought about the last 8 months, the sticky notes, the 3 sleepless nights, the moment 2 weeks ago when she'd looked at the filing cabinet and understood, for the first time, that she might actually be able to make this work. She looked at the amended return draft open on her desk. She looked at the second chair, which had Beckett's faint impression in the fabric from 3 weeks of sitting in it. The engagement letter, she said. I'll draft it myself. Standard terms, my exit clause, proper invoicing structure, full disclosure of every account and numbered company I need to see to do the work properly. She looked at him, and you don't tell me half of something and expect me to work with the rest. I need the complete picture, or I can't do this honestly. He was quiet. You're staying. I'm taking the contract, she said, on my terms. For a moment he just looked at her. Whatever he was measuring, He appeared to find it adequate. "All right," said Beckett. Faye pulled the legal pad toward her. "Then let's finish the 2021 amendments before the end of the month. Pull the numbered company file. Let's do this properly." Beckett reached across the desk and pulled the file from the stack. Outside, the snow had let up for the first time in a week. The parking lot glittered under the sodium lights, the old tire tracks filled in and smoothed over, the surface clean and uncommitted, waiting to record whatever came next. Faye uncapped her pen and the numbers finally began to balance.